Welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm your host for this program, which attempts to give us all a little more insight into the doings in our state capital and the personalities involved in and around state government. Our guest today is someone who has had a chance to observe those doings and be involved as an observer rather than as someone who is an actor on the stage. Ron Blankenbaker, who is a political columnist for the Statesman Journal and a reporter for the Statesman Journal. Welcome to Capital Insight.
Thank you, Kevin.
We've been chatting a little bit before we started today. I was talking a little bit about, we were talking a little bit about medicine and politics, and but before we get into that, because that's a topic I'm going to want to talk about today, I'd like to know a little bit more about you, or share that with our audience. Where do you come from?
Well, I'm not sure about the medical reference there, but...
well, not on you.
Where do I come from? Well, like everyone else, I was born and I grew up. I was born in central Washington. I grew up in southwest Washington. I was educated in the state of Washington. I came to Oregon when I got out of the Army, when I was drafted back in the 50s. I started in the news business with the Associated Press in Portland. I was still going to college. I started as a copy boy, when there were copy boys. I don't know what you would call them now.
A copy boy is the person who brings copy down to the...
You did all the grunt work of journalism. And that was the way a lot of reporters started in those days. And I got interested in this thing very much. Actually, I had relatives that were in journalism who had done rather well. Matter of fact, considerably better than I've done. But they were kind of an inspiration. And I went from the Associated Press to a string of small newspapers across the Northwest, and finally settled in Salem at the old Statesman Journal. That was before the two papers were merged into the...
Was that when it was called the Oregon Statesman?
Well, that was the Oregon
paper?
Statesman, yeah. And there was a Capital Journal in the afternoon.
Now, how long have you been with the Statesman Journal or its predecessor?
As of as of September, I'm getting my birthday and my anniversary date mixed up. As of September, I've been here 32 years.
So if I take that back from 93, 61 or so, you've arrived?
Yes, that's right.
I'm doing my quick math.
No, you're very good.
So you were here when, for instance, President Kennedy came
right.
through campaigning?
I know where I was the day that Kennedy was assassinated. I was in the newsroom of the old Oregon Statesman.
That's a long history then that you've had of journalism in Salem. You've become something of a fixture in the Salem community. I don't know if anyone ever wants to be a fixture, but I mean someone who's well known and I think respected for having his own mind and an independent spirit compared to the editorial board. That is, you've often had a different perspective on issues than the editorial board. Throughout all of that process, have you seen some changes in the political scene in Oregon?
Oh, I think I've seen a number of changes. The media and politics are so intertwined, and all the changes in the media, of course, have had a great effect on politics. Not the least of those being the cost of politics, the cost of running for office, and the ever-escalating cost of campaigning for office. As you well know, it's become horrendous. Legislative House races now cost almost as much as statewide races cost when I first came to Oregon. That's had a tremendous impact on the process. I think that we haven't seen it yet, but we will see a great impact in the next couple of years from the term limit law that was passed by the voters. From there, and that will have an enormous effect on the process. In that elected officials, I think, are going to become in short supply, at least experienced ones, and the people who have the experience and knowledge is, as you know, can be a real factor in the power of politics, will rest probably in the hands of people who are paid staff members, or even people like myself, I suppose, who have some kind of a background, that the elected official will be kind of denied because, for example, in your own office, 6 years and you're out.
Well, that's probably one of the most dramatic changes we're still going to see because it was passed as part of the term limits for Congress. And by the way, whenever I appeared anywhere to debate that measure, the proponents were always talking about Congress and keep those rascals out, and I always said, well, but you've thrown the state legislature in here, and look at our turnover rate in the state legislature, why don't you respond to that? And even in rebuttal, they would never come back and talk about the legislature, but that was thrown in, and now it's in our Constitution. The irony is that's the one part of it that probably will be effective, because we can control our state legislature. There's a big issue as to whether or not we can do it for Congress.
Well, of course, even a grander irony, I think, was that in the Oregon legislature, it kind of term limited itself over the years. In the years, because I've been covering the legislative process directly for more than 20 years now, and I've seen a number of, for example, houses go through legislative processes, and until recently, the Oregon House turned over just about a third of its members every session through attrition, death, getting beat by someone else, whatever. About 20 or more new members every session until quite recently, about the time you came on the scene, matter of fact, when there was a kind of a tightening down of the two sides. The Republicans and the Democrats became very close, and I think it was kind of a nobody wants to budge, no one wants to blink, no one wants to back off, and people were staying in office, some of them longer than they might have in the past, and the turnover got down to a half dozen or 10 or so members a session. But before that, for many, many years, about a third turnover.
There seems to have been a lot of pressure. I was elected in '88, so I've been in office since January of '99. A lot of pressure to maintain your seat, to sort of help circle the wagons and protect your group, your caucus. Is that because of increased partisanship? Have you seen a shift in terms of the partisanship in the legislature, or has that always been there? I
think it's always been there. I think it's played out in different ways. But I think it has always been very much a part of that process. The history of it is that over the long haul, many years, one side or the other would be in such disproportionate control that they could talk about not being partisan. Because, for example, if you go back not so far in Oregon history, you'll find perhaps one Democrat in the entire body of 90 lawmakers. Now, what good would it do a guy to talk about the Democratic cause? He's the one voice in the wilderness, that sort of thing. And even more recently, you go back into the 50s and you look at the House and the Senate, and they were extremely Republican. And then the change came on, and I'm not sure what caused it in the 60s. Some people say it was the fallout of Watergate, which I tend to disregard. Others say it was a change in the way we elect our legislators, going to the single district thing rather than being elected to the county at large, and that the Democrats took advantage of that and got control and didn't let up on it for a long time. For example, before Vic Atiyeh became governor, he was the Senate Republican leader, and he had a caucus of 6. That's the time when I coined the phrase a caucus in a phone booth, because they could just about meet in a phone booth at that time. But 24 Democrats, 6 Republicans. So there wasn't much to be partisan with in those instances. And in that same period, the Democrats in the House had as many as, 36 up to 38 members.
So we've seen this, I guess for instance, a lot of us talk about partisan bickering this last session, this overlong last session that we had. Maybe it just became more obvious because the numbers were so tight, 16 Democrats, 14 Republicans in the Senate, and 32-28 Republicans again in charge in the House. Excuse me, Democrats in charge of the Senate, Republicans in charge of the House. Tight numbers.
Well, it got close, and I think that you as an inside player, an elected official, know that what it got down, when you get that close, it calls for a considerable amount of discipline that is not there when you have lopsided numbers and advantages. When you have, if you had 40 Democrats in the House, you could afford to have 3 or 4 people kind of running off the ranch from the party line. But when you get down to where it's 31-29, 32-28, that's a different story. And you have to watch every member and count those votes closely. And I think that causes, yes, for more tension and perhaps more unhappiness.
Perhaps also harder sometimes to get the votes necessary to do the job.
That's right. As I say, that's the discipline
part. I'm going to pause for a moment and mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem. I'm your host. And our guest today is Ron Blankenbaker, a political columnist and reporter for the Oregon Statesman Journal right here in Salem. We were just talking about party discipline, and I thought that we'd pick up a little on that because there's a few of us rogue members who have an agreement with our caucuses, at least I do, that I'll be with the party on matters of procedure, but that I'm not obligated to follow through on any substantive matter. That is, I just vote in terms of my conscience and my constituents. Even with that kind of an agreement, when I first ran, though, I found that there's a lot of pressure to go along with the majority of your caucus because they are trying to move a program and you want to be a team player. And granted, we can't have 60 individualists in the legislature if we're going to pass legislation. Have you seen any increase in terms of that kind of pressure put on party members as the numbers have gotten tighter and tighter?
Yes, I think you get your finger on it. It is there. There is more pressure. It's a discipline thing. Each side has only got so many votes. They don't have any votes to spare. I can't say they have some votes. They have no votes to spare. At least the way the numbers broke out in this last session. What was it? 32-28 in the House and 16-14 in the Senate. There's no slack. And I'm sure it got very nasty at times for some of the players. For example, remember how the sales tax thing came down in the Senate, and you had Republicans who really kind of lost their sense of discipline there because they could have forced certain Democrats, certain local Democrats, to have voted a way they probably didn't want to. If for no other reason than the idea that the anti-sales tax position has long been the position held by the Democratic Party of Oregon. And these people, some of them had to vote for it.
Well, there was significant irony on the sales tax vote in both the House and the Senate because you have people such as myself who have publicly said they don't like a sales tax, and I put it somewhere in my seventh, I always say, on my list of the kinds of taxes I think that would be worthwhile. Feeling that somehow as part of a team, well, we'll send it out to the voters and we have to try to give it a shot and all that. And yet the Democratic Party platform for the state for years has said the Democratic Party is opposed to a sales tax. And it's sort of a switch in roles here.
People come to town and they get a new religion kind of thing here, become new legislative Democrats, I guess.
Well, but it tells me a lot about the pressure politics too, because there I could be saying, well, wait a minute, I'm lined up with the Democratic Party as far as the platform goes on this. Why should I be under any pressure to go along? Then you end up though with lowest common denominator politics, where, and on that issue, the sales tax was the only kind of, quote, tax reform that was going to come out, and if you thought tax reform itself was a good idea, you kind of felt like, gee, maybe you should vote for it. On the other hand, other ideas that maybe weren't as popular with the legislators may be more acceptable to the public.
Well, it's kind of like a sales tax is an Oregon legislative equivalent for Democrats of their antagonism to the sales tax of a Democrat on the national congressional scene, antagonism towards the North American Free Trade Agreement. I mean, they're just, they go against both, well, one very much goes against the Democratic Party's longtime constituency, or at least that which has been most closely identified with, wage earners, organized wage earners, that sort of thing. And that's here in Oregon too. I mean, it exists. But it gets kind of bollocksed here, because here you have the public employee unions are really the major force in organized labor anymore, and public employee unions feel that they need some other source of revenue than that which they now subsist on. Therefore, the pressure for a sales tax, this undemocratic thing.
Over the years, have you seen a number of these sort of contradictions that develop politically in Oregon? I mean, Tom McCall seems to me to be a living, well, now deceased, but at the time a living contradiction in the sense that many people would have thought of him more as like a populist Democrat than as a Republican. But maybe that's because we have our own bias and preconceived notions of what a populist Democrat's supposed to be all about. How did you react to someone like Tom McCall?
Well, I thought he was an amazing politician. He was certainly the most popular politician statewide in Oregon that I watched. He wasn't as liberal as history would have him. Matter of fact, he has kind of a liberal tinge there that is kind of the way John F. Kennedy is regarded. And in fact, if you were there at the time and knew how Kennedy actually reacted to certain issues, he was a pretty conservative guy in many ways. But history has been more kind to him. And I think, and I don't think I want to say this, that history's been more kind to Tom McCall than he deserves. I don't mean that. But he was, you know, Tom McCall, for example, had to be talked into the bottle bill and that sort of thing, which was a brainchild of some merchants over on the coast, and was carried forward in the legislature by a fellow by the name of Paul Hanneman, a Republican over the coast, and that was really kind of forced down Tom's throat as a good idea. But I guess the point of a really good functioning politician is that once he'd swallowed it and chewed it around a bit before he swallowed it, he decided he took it, he embraced it, he made it his. And he did make it a success, because I don't think it would have been a success without him.
Because of you need not just the legislative package, but you need the commitment of the executive to follow through and make sure it's really implemented, I suppose.
He really did. Well, he really went out and sold it. And then he became a national salesman for the bottle bill. But there were a lot of those things, you know, the beach bill, the bottle bill, the river bill. Some of those things, former Governor Bob Strawberry was much more of a champion in reality on it than Tom McCall was. But Bob, although he was certainly as tall as Tom, seemed always destined to kind of stand in Tom's shadow.
Is that partially personality too? Tom McCall always came across as sort of the outgoing, hail fellow, well met. Bob Straub is a quieter individual, at least from, I wasn't close, in fact, I never met Tom McCall.
That's a fair assessment. McCall, who was a wonderful guy for a person like me to watch, but I'm not really sure what he was or what he was supposed to be. He had this kind of a Massachusetts via Eastern Oregon accent that no one, you couldn't really pin down, that he played with to make himself unique, and he was a creature of the media. He was a broadcaster, worked in the old press room before he was in office, but he knew the media very well. Matter of fact, he used to kind of, in those days, of course, there wasn't the security there is now, and he'd kind of wander the Capitol at will. And it was, you know, quite frequently, if you wanted to find Tom McCall, you'd go down and look around the old press room, and he'd be down there holding forth with one or two reporters.
Maybe we need to have some of our political leadership a little more willing to do that.
Well, you know, that's funny. I don't know if it's necessary or not, but I will tell you that it hasn't been that way for a long time. Vic Attia used to come down occasionally, and that's about the last. Neil Goldschmidt, I think in his entire 4 years, came down maybe once when he didn't have a set press conference. He, oddly enough, as glib as Neil Goldschmidt is regarded to be, he wasn't comfortable in that kind of he wasn't really that comfortable with reporters, to be frank about it. Barbara Roberts, well, she not only doesn't come down, she's not very accessible upstairs in her office either.
Can't beat down her door, eh?
Well, no, as a matter of fact, one of the curiosities of the Roberts administration, until quite recently, the press room was off limits to reporters. It was in the locked away from the public part of the governor's office until quite recently. Then they've, in the last few months, they've rearranged their deck chairs up there, I guess, on the Titanic, and now a reporter can get into the press office to find out what a schedule is or something.
Well, we're seeing some real change here in terms of political personalities in the state, and I have to admit, as a small-time player, I'm fairly new to the scene. I came to Oregon in 1974, and I was first elected in '88, and so I don't have some of the history that you have. And looking back, it's interesting that we're
You
also...
must be a fast learner, because I keep thinking of you as an old-timer, say.
Well, relatively speaking, I'm going to be at the rate we're changing right now, looking at the changeover in the legislature. And actually, that does bring me around. I was going to be talking about new leadership here in Oregon, and we're looking at a scene now where both the Senate and the House are up for grabs as far as the majority goes next time around. The executive branch is up for grabs as far as the governor's race is concerned. And probably the House races are going to be more determinative about control. The Senate races, because of the numbers, as you've pointed out in your columns, are sort of skewed right now in favor of the Republicans being in charge, if for no other reason that more Democratic seats are up, since only half the Senate is up each time. Do you see a dynamic of change in terms of some of the old leadership fading away and a new generation coming in? Or is this just my temporary short-term perception of things?
Well, I'm certainly not sure that you're wrong in your perception. And there ain't no such thing as a done deal in politics. It ain't over till it's over. I'd be foolish to sit here and say, yeah, this is the way it's going to be. I would say that there are a great deal of factors which seem to weigh currently in favor of Republicans taking control of both chambers and the governor's office in the next election. Doesn't mean it'll happen, but the factors are there. Not the least of them being just a general mood, I think, of people that go out and vote in these elections that I would think is probably more in tune with what's generally considered the Republican philosophy than being in tune with what is generally considered to be the Democratic philosophy of politics as it's practiced in this state. But at the same time, you and I both know the legislative races in particular are races of personality. And politics be damned. If you've got the personality to get elected, you'll get elected, no matter how you vote.
I think that we'll be watching some of those races to see what kind of individuals get into those races, because that will tell us a lot about how we're going to see the lineup in the House and the Senate.
We have some good contests going on, I think, right here in town. We have in the Senate to fill the seat that was vacated when Jim Hill became state treasurer and was by appointment Democrat Catherine Weber, who's never been elected to any public office, will be challenged for that seat by a veteran House member and colleague of yours, a Republican Gene Durfler. I think that has to be a good contest. It certainly will be a hard-fought contest. I happen to consider Senator Weber probably the more dynamic of the two personalities. I mean, she relates very well. She relates well on camera, by the way. But Gene Durfler is probably one of the hardest campaigning legislators that I've seen. I've heard a lot of people talk about how hard they campaign. He goes
does
out.
it, huh?
He really does it. Yeah, and has worked for him so far. Of course, the bigger the district is, now he's going from a House district to a Senate district. As you well know, the door knocking becomes really onerous. You can only knock on so many doors in a given day, and you really have to plan and be organized and have a great deal of energy to go out and knock on all the necessary doors to cover a Senate district. That'll be a good race. I don't know what kind of race you're going to have. Both Salem Senate races are up for grabs, as you know. Patricia Smith's seat, supposedly that's going to be a heavily challenged race, but to the best of my knowledge, Republicans have yet to come up with a challenger. Matter of fact, at one time I thought maybe you might be stepping into that race.
Well, actually, no, although, I mean, it's always an open question. Oh, of course I thought about it, but the time to think about it was really when it was an open seat 2 years ago, and I made the choice not to seek a Senate seat. That would have been the natural time to do it, and having made that, well, I guess it was 4 years ago now almost, having made that decision, I promised Tricia Smith early in the last session that I wasn't going to run against her, and I said that at the time because I was working with her on some legislation, and I was also proposing some legislation that I wanted her help with, and I didn't want any political dissonance. And considering the changes we're going through, some of us have to stay where we are to get the job done. I'm thinking, well, that's what the House will be all about. We need some folks with a little bit of seniority over there to help run the show. Speaking of shows, I'm going to mention to our audience that you're with us on Capitol Insight. We do take a break every once in a while to mention that. I'm your host, State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem. If you ever have any questions or concerns, or you'd like to just pass on some suggestions, feel free to write to me at Capitol Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. We're always glad to get any comments, questions, or suggestions. Our guest today is Ron Blankenbaker from the Statesman Journal, and we've been talking about all kinds of politics, which is of interest, of course, to me, but I hope will be of interest to our audience. We were talking about these immediate races, and Peter Courtney will be up, and again, I don't know if he's going to have a challenger. I don't know if I'll have a challenger. Tricia Smith's race is in the air. The funny thing about that is that some Republicans have been approaching me all year trying to get me to run in the Democratic primary against Tricia Smith. And I keep kind of wondering, then that must tell me they don't have a Republican candidate.
Well, seriously, the filing date's what, next March deadline? I don't think they do. They have a number of people out there who seem to be interested in removing Senator Smith from that office. And I don't know if that's fair or not, but I would say that she is not popular, certainly with the business lobby, for whatever reasons. And the number of people in the business lobby have indicated they would give a lot of support to whomever would run against her. I don't know who that would be. You know a great deal more about that district than I do. You represent half of it already. I think that it may have some peculiar dynamics to it. I think that there are a number of government employees in the district. At the same time, that a great deal of the district has a history of voting considerably more conservative than the representation is now offered, I think, by its current state senator.
Well, I think the demographics are pretty close to the demographics of my own House district, and it's an unusual set of demographics.
Oh, is that an improper assessment on my part?
No, I think your assessment is correct. That is, actually, we have a constituency that is in many respects naturally conservative, mixed in with a constituency of blue-collar workers and state employees, a much higher percentage than in most districts. And those are folks who are concerned about government doing its job and maintaining government. And yes, of course, behind that is a concern for, gee, where will I be a government employee in the future? So that's a little bit of leavening to add to that mix. But my perspective has been that historically we Democrats ran individuals, for instance, in my House district for 10 years who are far too liberal for the district. And you can find a moderate Democrat that'll fit the district and can do well with the electorate, but if you run a liberal Democrat, they kind of fall off the edge as far as getting the necessary votes in November. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not Tricia Smith, who's an acknowledged liberal Democrat, has some difficulty if she has a real strong opponent on the Republican side.
Well, of course, Salem's politics is a contradiction in a variety of ways, and I think the recent sales tax vote, without beating that issue entirely to death, is a grand example. The issue went down 75-25 statewide, but here in Salem, the stronghold of the public employee, the folks who would probably have the most to gain from the addition of a tax to the state coffers, it was what, almost 80-20. I don't know what that says about a lot of things. I don't know what that says about State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Norma Paulus, who was the most outspoken statewide office holder in behalf of the sales tax, and yet in her own home district, it did worse than it did elsewhere.
Well, I guess the closer some folks got to that issue, the more they knew about it, the less they liked it. I hate to say that, but that's in the capital area. I had a lot of state employees saying, you know, I know the budgets are on the line if there's no tax reform, but I just can't stand this sales tax. That's what I was hearing from folks.
Well, it's got to be a hard choice. I appreciate enlightened self-interest. I mean, you just can't be too mad about people if they're concerned about having a job tomorrow. I mean, that's pretty honest emotion when you go into a voting booth. And I think people have reason to be concerned about that. As you now look at the state budget picture, we had a governor announce $200 million worth of cuts are going to be made in the current budget somewhere, although I'm not sure that so many of them would be that telling about the general fund. But subsequent to that, we've now learned that the state has to pay up on what it took from the State Accident Insurance Fund 12 years ago, $81 million plus enters, counting. I don't know what the figure is now. Some people think it might be as much as $200 million. At the same time, you have other, as you as a lawyer know, interesting lawsuits hanging out there, some of them which don't look too good for the state. Among them, I think one involving out-of-state insurance companies, which has been the
differential premium tax. They're taxed higher than in-state
and they've been doing well in other states with that same issue, the complainants.
I think that your perception is right. We are now going through a process of what I'll call the politics of acknowledgement of past sins, of errors and omissions. And part of that, I say that jokingly, but really we've been constantly looking for somewhere else to borrow from Peter to pay Paul, or we've been taxing inappropriately, and now we're going to have to start paying for it.
And then I have to ask what happens then with if the court, which I think is supposed to look at it or hear arguments in January on video poker, and I guess the question is video poker a casino game? Because casinos are not allowed in our Constitution.
Well, it's going to be a gamble for us in politics, no matter how you look at it. It's a gamble for me to wrap this show up on time because I'm being given that signal. And I want to thank you all for joining us on Capital Insight. And thank you very much, Ron, for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.